Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. I just want to check, is the sound all right? You're hearing me? Okay, and some visuals will appear magically in the background as well. And as that's happening, I'll just offer a couple moments of context about why I'm here. Even before I do that, thank you, Adam and Paula and the organizers and everybody who's here on a weekend to think about how we can better understand nature in relation to a resilient future in the face of climate change. It's no small thing. And I have the pleasure of joining many convergences. I get to stand here from time to time and also sit where you are and listen. I've got to say, this is a really unique convergence. And that actually gives me more hope than anything else. This you could say this is the choir. You know, you're here because I think you want to talk about climate. But it's a different kind of choir. And that gives me a lot of hope. While my slides are coming up, I'll also just offer a little bit more context about what I'm about to do so I can quickly pop through the slides. I spent a year in Brazil as a youth. I actually grew up in Toronto. I've already said something that rhymes with out, so I've outed myself as a Canadian. And I've had the pleasure of spending places in a few parts of the world, and that's some of what I'll touch on. So I'm going to touch on 3 separate pieces of information, but I hope they interrelate and connect to the broader theme of listening to nature. And firstly, I'll just set the stage a little bit, a sort of once upon a time, who am I and what puts me on this stage. And as Adam mentioned, I work with business. That's sort of how I keep the lights on, as it were. But I'm a bit of a germ, or maybe a spore, within the business community, because I think it's quite important that business be a force for good. And I heard, and how many of you were here yesterday? Actually, so quite a few, and I think you probably hear in your day-to-day some of the very real concerns with which I share about the role of industry in our future. So nonetheless, I spend most of my time inside of large, often global corporations, and I do that in good faith, and I believe in what I do. So I'd like to share a little bit more about what that means. And in the middle of all this, I'll, thank you, can I start advancing now? Yes, very good. In the middle of all this, thank you very much, John, I will just share an anecdote from a book that I'm mostly done and in the process of bringing out to the world. And it's sort of the moment where the penny really dropped for me about what trees have been trying to tell me for a long time. So I'll share a brief excerpt of one of the chapters of my book. It'll be the first time it's shared with an audience. So I'm very excited about that. I'm a little bit nervous, and I certainly welcome your feedback. And then I'll veer back into, so what does that have to do with my day job, and how am I spending that penny that really dropped? Actually, it was sort of a bunch of pennies hitting me on the head. And so that's what we'll talk about. And I also just want to say, audience-wise, it's such a pleasure to be in the audience where I was one of 3 people knitting. So shout out to the other knitters. I'm a knitter and a spinner and a weaver, and I firmly believe that it's been integrating with those very real pieces of our everyday lives that's been a great gift for me, and learning from folks with a lot of experience in that. But that's a story for another day. So I mentioned I'm from Toronto. This is a little doodle from my iPad. I was born in the 70s, right around the time the CN Tower was built. I lived within a walk of a very easy view of the CN Tower, so quite centrally. But for those of you who know Toronto, it's actually a nature-rich city. It's built on 3 riverbeds, really, and some of them they sort of filled in, but they'll still run through your basement if you're not careful. And so for me, my memories of growing up as a city mouse were very much about playing in the ravines, the river valleys, lots of different trees. Of course, it was all deforested, so it's reforested, but still a very green existence for me, and that really stamped who I am. I also had the very good fortune of spending a lot of time on a family, what we call a cottage, up on Manitoulin Island, which is in the northern part of Lake Huron. Again, secondary forest, but as a kid, you're not thinking about, what was here before, or, who did we take this land from? You're thinking, I want to go play in the forest, which I spent a lot of time doing up on Manitoulin as well. This is a sugar maple bush. We produce maple syrup there for fun most years. My sister now lives there and runs a microbrewery in Gorbet, if you're ever that way. And I also, this is a little tough to see because it's so faded. I'm not sure if you can see the date, 1984. So as a teenager, just sketching and watching the world around me, very much influenced by trees. And I was cleaning out my home office the other day and came upon all these sketches I'd forgotten about. So I've been doodling and trying to understand trees and nature really for a long time. And that's really shaped who I am. Adam mentioned that I lived in Brazil, indeed. I did a Rotary exchange student. Any Rotarians here? or exchange students. Yeah, I lived in Brasilia too, in 1989, the first, in 1989, the first democratic election in Brazil. You might have noticed there was another one recently, and there's been a few. That was an incredible experience, and I actually believe quite concretely that one of our biggest solution spaces in terms of climate is exposure to new and different ideas. Sort of biomimetically, the way nature loves diversity, puts different things like these different minds and different perspectives in the room. Nothing like a student exchange to deliver that to you. And so I was plopped into Brasilia in 1989 as the government transitioned to democracy. Didn't speak a word, like literally didn't speak a word of Portuguese. But after a year immersed in a culture where no one spoke English for the most part, now that's shifted, I was fluent, and I had such an enriching experience. For 10 days, my high school class went on a field trip, and there, when you go on a field trip, you can go to the Amazon. So I learned the term, which then was the greenhouse effect, o efeito estufo. I learned about climate change for the first time sitting in an eco school in the Amazon in January 1990. So that was a huge wake up. In fact, one of my classmates and I from that time, we were so moved by what we heard. We were like, whoa, this is a big deal. We should write a book about this. So we go back to our school in Brasilia, and with our pencils and our workbooks, we're drawing diagrams of the Earth's crust and radiation. And then we got busy and grew up, and he became an engineer, and I did other things. I'm going to skip a few chapters of my life and bring us to New York, where I now reside. And this is me after a running race. I do a fair bit of distance running, which has been another great learning journey where you're sort of moving at human speed and making eye contact with people. I almost never run with something in my ears because I love, first of all, to not get run over by traffic, but also to hear the birds. And if you run in New York City, especially in Central Park, and you're even half awake, you're going to hear the hawks. And when you hear one, and then you get a few miles down the other way, and you hear the other, you realize there's this whole drama playing out between, I think it's still Pale Male. I don't know if any of you are following the hawk romance in New York, but Pale Male kind of runs the show there, and he's had a few girlfriends. So I was just finishing up a race, and I couldn't help but notice this. I believe this was one of the cherry trees a couple springs ago. So this is a very compressed way of saying I've been blessed with living in different parts of the world, but everywhere I went, I feel like nature was sort of trying to tell me stuff. And meanwhile, I, like most people, have sort of had to, and this is another iPad doodle of a tree by 59th Street Bridge, which is right by where I live. But meanwhile, like most people, I've had to, go about my life, pay the bills. This is my version of fireworks, by the way. I took this on July 4th. I find it very weird that we blow things up to celebrate and then bother shorebirds and make smoke and everything. So on July 4th, I went into the Conservatory Garden in Central Park and shot. I have a whole series of these that sort of, those to me are much more bird-friendly and bug-friendly fireworks. But anyway, Lorraine, what do you do for a living? And my mother asks me this because she tries to explain it. So in a nutshell, I'm going to sort of bundle what I do for a living, which is even, I think, a funny framing, right? Like, what do you do for a living? Well, we're alive. So, like, for a living, we really mean how do you earn money? And I'd say right there, that's a problematic human framing. Again, that's probably another conversation for another time. But the easiest way to explain what I do, I'm going to start with a broken mental model and explain how my job is to try to understand this mental model, understand it within myself, and then help explain why it's broken with anybody who will pay attention to me or invite me to their meetings and strategy sessions. How many people are familiar with the term the triple bottom line? So it's kind of a known meme. A fellow named John Elkington coined the term approximately 20 years ago. He's currently one of my most active collaborators. Technically, he'd be a client, but I'd say we're just friends, and we like to think at one another, and then sometimes companies bring us together to think at them. So in a way, this is representative of the triple bottom line, the idea that a company or a for-profit entity would put some time into considering its social, environmental, and financial aspects. Sometimes financial is expressed as economic, sometimes it's just described as the business. And of course, I'm speaking English, but this is a global concept, so those words get synonymized in many different ways. I say this is a broken model because what I often see happening with companies is they say, we really need to balance the triple bottom line. We need to balance our social impacts against our financial impacts. Balance, balance. I like that idea, sort of. The problem is that it's completely facacta. Like, no, you don't need to balance your business against other bottom lines. Your business is nested within society, which is nested within the environment. And there's so many ways I could blow up even this model. Like, actually, that business bubble should be invisibly small in terms of its real scale. And the word environment, in my humble opinion, is a bucket, when in fact it's really like the everything. So to describe it as a circle or a category or a thing from which we should be sort of marking things off is already problematic. But I'm sort of constrained to the English language and the syntax that we exist in. But even that, so that's nice, Lorraine. You take circles and you rearrange them on a slide. So like, well, in a way, going into that, this model doesn't equal that model is a project in and of itself. How to work with an organization, with an executive team, with a sustainability team. So most large companies have sustainability initiatives, goals, strategies, reports. How to work with the folks responsible for that and help them, first of all, just do that, have those goals, understand where they can potentially make or stop making impacts, depending on the context, but then also make that shift from saying, no, you're not trying to balance, you're trying to exist within a thriving, wider context. In some cases, that means understand that wider context. Like, oh, we didn't realize the degree to which these external factors are actually internal factors. Might sound silly, but it's kind of true. But in other cases, like, we realize it, but that's not the way our business was built. We hear this talk of, 2020 has become a real milestone, or in some cases 2030 for companies now, because 2020 is too close. But a lot of companies talking about their 2020 strategies describe that they were built, the structure of their businesses were largely built in 1920. So how do you adapt a business to be thriving in 2020 when it was really built in 1920? So that's sort of the puzzle. I articulate that in a number of ways. And by the way, there are links embedded here. I'm happy to share anything, and a lot of this, all of this is linked on my website. This is a report I co-authored with John Elkington, coiner of the triple bottom line, on behalf of a commission that's been exploring a business that can deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals. Talk a bit more about that in a moment. So this would just be one example where I'm putting ideas together, case studying examples of businesses that are sort of showing emergent examples of these new business models or adapted business models. And I'm going to give you a lens to test, how would you know that a business model sort of belongs in that future or needs to iterate its way into a new state? I would say the really handy lens is if you see a business expressing the good things it's doing, up until recently, I would say a lot of that information in their sustainability reports, their wonderful programs, their community engagement, there's all different ways we experience business. The vast majority is focused on a sidebar that is spending money to do good things. And I'm not suggesting those are bad ideas. I think companies, it's wonderful that they support charities or they enable some kind of community activity. That's terrific. But they're spending money to do good things, or possibly spending money to do less bad things, reduce harm. The lens I look for, and this touches on the business model aspect of it, is how are they making money? Because a business is in the business of making money, and I'm actually comfortable with that. That's how come I got to wear these clothes, I got to get here physically, I got to have the electronic equipment that's around me functioning. That's what business does. It creates and delivers on needs through products and services. In doing that, is it delivering social benefit? Is it restoring ecosystems? Is it sequestering more CO2 than it's emitting? Whatever it is that it's doing, and that's far beyond the energy matrix, right? That's every product and service. That's every category of our industrial society. That's what I mean when I say breaking that mental model, taking that little does not equal sign, and enabling companies to understand that more. So what I say to my mother when she says, but Lorraine, what do you actually do? I say, I put it in two categories. And one category is basically this sort of thinking about these business models, engaging with companies, writing reports, reviewing, providing editorial guidance on some of the reporting, or advisory services. And one of the companies I work most closely with is actually based in Brazil. I'll touch on that in a minute. So that's kind of relatively traditional consulting or advisory work, and I have the pleasure of doing that with John Elkington and a few other partners. That's one of two things. The other thing